Hi everyone! I did my research on the effects of U.S. intervention in Guatemala from the Cold War era to present day. My research question was, how has the U.S. support of military regimes and insertion of structural adjustment programs throughout the Cold War and Guatemalan Civil War affected violence, economic stability, and migration in present-day Guatemala? Some important contexts for the events that occurred in Guatemala were the unequal land distribution dates back to the 16th century. The land was essentially divided up into 22 regions that were allocated to and owned by only 22 families. Inequality persisted throughout time and was the cause for the agrarian land reforms instituted in 1952 by President Jacobo Arbenz. The U.S.-backed coup resulted in the removal of Arbenz and the installment of the Carlos Castillo Armas authoritarian regime in 1954. The Guatemalan Civil War followed, which was started by left-wing guerrillas in an attempt to overthrow the government. The 36-year-long Civil War resulted in over 200,000 deaths and disappearances. Lastly, the Civil War, along with economic instability and new forms of violence, has caused a refugee crisis starting from the middle of the Civil War on to today. In order to understand the U.S.'s role in the 1954 coup, as well as their intentions, it was imperative for me to acknowledge the role of the United Fruit Company, or the UFCO. They were the largest agricultural corporation in Guatemala at the time and owned 62% of arable land. Agrarian reform laws targeted UFCO lands that were going unused and aimed to redistribute them to small farmers in order to promote income equality. This threat caused for the UFCO to lobby for the support of the U.S. government as well as spend over $500,000 on a disinformation campaign against Arbenz. The importance of this company in relation to the U.S. government was that not only did the government rally behind them, they were them. Hiring between the U.S. government and UFCO were heavily intertwined, which can be seen through Alan Dulles, the U.S. CIA director, who was also on the board of directors for the UFCO. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State for the Eisenhower administration, was also the UFCO attorney. Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. UN ambassador, was also a UFCO stockholder, and Ed Whitman, Eisenhower's personal secretary's husband, was the UFCO PR manager. The implications of their entanglement is that the threat of communism, which was what the U.S. seemed to be fighting against, was not the only push for the coup. Operation PB Success was the first CIA operation of its kind where the U.S. used covert and overt operations to oust Arbenz. Its other primary goal was to obtain plausible denial of their involvement in the coup. The operation had a $3 million budget for the use of paramilitary and psychological warfare to demoralize and dismantle the president and replace him with a quote-unquote pro-U.S. government. The premeditated plan had 6 stages, each of which proved direct intervention of the U.S. government in the coup. In 1954, it was successful and Castillo Armas was installed and was followed by 3 more decades of authoritarian regimes. For my research, I analyzed various leaked secret government documents to indicate U.S. involvement as well as prove their intent. In 1966, there were State Department and CIA correspondence with Guatemalan officials with requests for counterinsurgency techniques to which the U.S. complied and also supplied military psychological warfare training. Moreover, a safe house was created to secretly discuss tactics, and the CIA was briefed through secret cables on various Guatemalan leftist executions. A 1968 secret memo by Deputy Chief of Mission in Guatemala, Byron Vacchi, includes the acknowledgement of U.S. involvement as well as the harmful effects they have stood by and watched. In the excerpt on the side, you can see that he states, quote, "We have condoned counterterror. We may even in effect have encouraged or blessed it," end quote. This acknowledgement comes before Ronald Reagan proceeded to continue the supplying of economic aid and training of the military by increasing the aid by $93 million in 6 years. The war ended in 1996 when peace accords were signed. Of the resulting 200,000 deaths, 93% of civilian executions were done by the Guatemalan military forces, and 83% of victims were indigenous Maya. Military intervention was eventually replaced by economic intervention, which was included in Stage 6 of Operation PB Success. Implementation of neoliberal policies were advertised as intended to help Guatemalan development when self-interest was the highest priority. This can be shown through various statements of U.S. officials indicating their intentions. The National Security Council policy stipulated that, quote, the United States should seek to avoid giving the impression that the United States is guaranteeing or underwriting the achievement of specific rates of economic growth or the fulfillment of overall economic targets in less developed countries, end quote. As well as another State Department memo from 1954, which indicates that the United States policy-making entities, quote, consciously fashion the U.S. foreign aid program to promote U.S. economic interests regardless of the consequences for Latin Americans, end quote. Furthermore, it is interesting to note the contradiction between the ways the U.S. rose to economic power, which was by using protectionist policies, and their encouragement of foreign and private investment for Guatemala. Another contradiction between their intentions and actions comes from their support of the coup, where they deemed the agrarian reforms as communistic. However, later, when economic analyses indicated the necessity of Guatemalan citizens' purchasing power for industrialization, the U.S. promoted and enforced land redistribution because it was of benefit to their own company's profits. Lastly, although it is indicated that GNP grew greatly during this time, profits were distributed unequally to corrupt elites. Furthermore, the debt they incurred to the U.S. due to the neoliberal reforms caused for 35% inflation, devaluation of the quetzal, and for worsening conditions for the low and middle classes, but benefits for corrupt military leaders. After the immense political destabilization of the war and economic desperation Guatemala was facing, not only did the war cause people to flee, but new forms of violence including drug trafficking, gang violence, and rising homicide rates caused for Guatemalans to seek refuge in the U.S. I argue that their economic situations are a violence in and of themselves, and that the U.S. choosing to adopt the pull narrative, which is the idea that immigrants are coming to the U.S. for opportunities rather than being pushed by external forces, is proof of their refusal to adhere to international asylum laws. Under international law, refugees are persons outside of their country of origin who are in need of international protection because of a serious threat to their life, physical integrity, or freedom in their country of origin as a result of persecution, armed conflict, violence, or serious public disorder. By choosing the pull narrative, issuing deterrence policies, and turning away asylum seekers, the U.S. has failed to comply with international law. My research concludes that because the U.S. instigated the coup, supported a 36-year-long war and genocide, and implemented self-serving economic policies, they helped to create the corrupt government and situations that kept poor Guatemalans in poverty, economic distress, and experiencing nonstop violence. After all of the problems they caused, the U.S. still does not take responsibility for their past actions, nor do they acknowledge the refugee crisis as a problem of their making.